You think you disappear and I just let that go? I felt his hand before I heard his voice. Julian's fingers locked around my bare arm like a vice, right there under the Grand Plaza's chandelier light, where 500 of the city's wealthiest people were busy pretending the world was beautiful. Nora. His voice was soft. That was always the worst sign. You look stunning tonight. I tried to step back. He stepped with me. Julian, don't. Don't what? He smiled, that slow, patient smile I used to mistake for charm. I just want to talk.
Look at me.
6 months. 6 months of blocked numbers and new routes and checking over my shoulder at every corner. 6 months of rebuilding something that felt like a life. And he found me at the Harrington Foundation Gala like I'd never left. Like the restraining order was a suggestion. Like the bruises had never happened. I yanked my arm. His grip tightened. You embarrassed me, he breathed into my ear. You think you can just walk out and I don't collect? Around us, the string quartet played on. A woman in emerald silk caught my eye and quickly looked away. A man in a tuxedo laughed too loudly at someone else's joke. The crowd wasn't oblivious. They were choosing. That's when Julian reached for his glass. I saw it happen in slow motion, his wrist tilting, the deep red wine arcing through the chandelier light, and then it hit. Cold. Violent. A cascade of dark crimson flooding down the front of my royal blue satin gown, soaking into the fabric, spreading like something far worse than wine. The humiliation detonated through my chest like a physical blow. Gasps rippled outward. Someone laughed, actually laughed, before catching themselves. I stood there, wine dripping from the bodice of my dress, unable to move. That old paralysis. That old familiar freeze. There, Julian murmured, his snarl dropping into something almost satisfied. Now everyone can see exactly what you are. The room shifted. Not with outrage. Not with help. The crowd simply parted the way water moves around something it instinctively fears, and in the space they left behind, a man stepped forward. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't shouting. He moved through that ballroom the way a dark tide moves through shallow water, unhurried, inevitable, and utterly silent. Korean, tall. Dressed in a suit so precisely tailored it looked like architecture, dark navy. No tie. The collar of his crisp white shirt open at the throat as if rules were things that applied to lesser men. His face was completely, unnervingly still. Not angry, not alarmed, calculating. His eyes weren't on me. They moved past me entirely, landing on Julian with the kind of focus that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with conclusion. He stopped beside us. And then slowly, deliberately without breaking that ice-cold gaze, he raised both hands to his chest and adjusted his cufflinks. The gold caught the light. One side, then the other. That was all. The blood drained from Julian's face. I had spent 6 months terrified of this man beside me, but in that moment, watching Julian read something in a pair of adjusted cufflinks that made his grip on my arm go instantly slack, I understood that fear had a hierarchy, and I was in the presence of its ceiling. Who? Julian started, his voice cracking on the single syllable. Who are you? Bae Kyong didn't answer. He didn't need to. In a room where money was supposed to be the only power that mattered, 500 people had just watched a man do absolutely nothing and understood it as a death sentence. Julian's hand dropped from my arm. The wine continued to drip from the hem of my gown, pooling dark and red against the marble floor. And I didn't know it yet, didn't know about the chemical compound laced into that wine, didn't know about the men waiting at every exit with my description. I didn't know that the stain on my dress was a signal, and I was the message, but my old life had just ended. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. He didn't touch Julian. That was the part I couldn't stop thinking about afterward. Bae Kyong simply held that gaze, that flat, bottomless stare, and Julian unraveled on his own, the way cheap fabric does under real pressure. I watched my ex-boyfriend, a man who had once put me through a wall, take one step back, then another. His mouth worked like he was searching for words that had all suddenly abandoned him. He found none. He turned, straightened his jacket with shaking hands, and walked away through the crowd without looking back. 500 people watched it happen, and not one of them made a sound. Kyong turned to me then, for the first time since he'd arrived. His expression didn't change still, that same controlled stillness, but his eyes moved over me once, quickly, taking inventory the way a man does when he's assessing damage rather than admiring a woman. He reached into his jacket and produced a folded white pocket square. He held it out. I stared at it. I don't need. Your hands are shaking. His voice was low, accented, precise, the kind of voice that didn't need volume to fill a room. Take it. I took it. I pressed it against the soaked bodice of my dress, uselessly, because the stain had already won. The wine had soaked through to my skin and was starting to feel cold and wrong against my ribs. We need to leave, he said. Not a suggestion. I have a car, not through the front. He said it the way someone says the bridge is out, a simple fact about the geography of the situation. He was already turning, already expecting me to follow, and I don't know if it was the shock or the residue of 6 months of survival instinct, but my feet moved after him before my mind caught up to the decision. He navigated the ballroom like he'd memorized it. Maybe he had. He moved us through the outer edge of the crowd, close to the gilded walls, away from the main drag of guests and the 4 exits that suddenly felt, though I couldn't have explained why, like mouths. I noticed the way his eyes moved, not frantically, not like a man looking for danger, but like a man cataloging everything that was already there. Once, he steered me left with a hand that barely grazed my elbow, redirecting us around a cluster of guests near the east corridor. I looked back and saw 2 men near that corridor, large, stiff-postured, wrong for the event in ways I couldn't quite articulate. Their eyes were scanning. Not the room. The exits. Something cold settled in my stomach that had nothing to do with the wine. We slipped through a service corridor that smelled of catering trays and polished concrete. Kyong pushed through a steel door at the end of it, and then we were outside, not the main entrance with its red carpet and valets and photographers, but a loading bay at the side of the building where a black car idled against the curb. A man stood beside it. He saw Kyong, opened the rear door without a word, and looked at me exactly once with no expression at all. I stopped walking. Where are you taking me? Kyong turned. In the loading bay's harsh yellow light, the angles of his face were sharper. The jaw, the cheekbones, the absolute absence of warmth. He studied me for a moment the way I imagined he studied everything. Not with curiosity, but with assessment. Somewhere those men inside cannot follow. What men? Who were they? Get in the car, Miss Parker. You know my name. I know a great deal. He said it without arrogance, which somehow made it worse. I will explain what is relevant. But not here. And not while you're standing in an open bay in a dress that is currently broadcasting your location. I looked down at the stain. Dark red against royal blue. Broadcasting, he'd said. I filed that word away somewhere behind my sternum where the dread was already building, and I got in the car. The compound was 40 minutes outside the city, and I spent the drive in silence because something about the stillness Kyong radiated made conversation feel like an imposition. He sat on the opposite side of the back seat, not looking at me, a phone in his hand. He typed in bursts, received responses, typed again. Once, he said something in Korean to the driver, quiet, 3 syllables, and the route changed. I watched the city lights thin out and give way to dark roads lined with high walls and private gates. The estate appeared behind one of those gates, modern, vast, the kind of architecture that doesn't announce wealth so much as enforce it all, clean glass faces and dark steel bones and light that fell from the interior like something controlled. A dozen people moved on the grounds, some visible, some half-shadows at the edges of the floodlights. None of them looked like staff. Inside, the compound was colder than I expected. Not in temperature, the air was perfectly regulated, but in atmosphere. No art on the walls. No personal photographs. Every surface was precise and purposeful, as if comfort had been considered and professionally declined. A woman met us in the entry hall, Korean, mid-30s, with a tablet in her arm and eyes that catalogued me the same way Kyong's had. She said something to him. He answered. She looked at my dress. "Come with me," she said to me in clean English. "There are dry clothes." I followed her to a room on the second floor, spare, gray, a bed and a window with a view of the lit grounds below. She set clothes on the bed, plain dark trousers, a soft sweater, nothing fancy. She was gone before I could do anything but memorize the efficient line of her posture. I changed. I left the ruined blue dress folded on the chair by the window and stood in borrowed clothes in a stranger's room in a compound I'd been escorted to by a man whose last name I didn't know, and I thought, with a clarity that surprised me, I need to leave. I found him downstairs. He was in a room that served as something between a study and an operations center screens on one wall, a long table with a laptop at its center, two men standing at the edge of the room who were very clearly not assistants. Kyong stood at the table looking at something on the screen, jacket off now, the sleeves of his white shirt rolled precisely to the forearm, the heavy gold watch catching the light on his wrist. "I want to go home," I said from the doorway. He didn't look up immediately. "No." "Excuse me?" He turned then, and the flatness of his expression wasn't unkind exactly, but it allowed no room for negotiation. "Sit down, Miss Parker. I'd rather stand, and I'd rather leave. What you'd rather do is not the operative factor right now." He pulled out a chair across the table and left the gesture there an offer, not a command, which somehow irritated me more. Julian Reeve owes a considerable sum of money to a syndicate operating in this city. The figure is significant enough that they have been looking for collateral. He paused. "You are the collateral." The room didn't move. I made sure of it. "I'm not involved with Julian. We haven't been together in over 6 months. The syndicate doesn't recognize the relevance of that distinction." He was watching me the way you watch someone absorb a diagnosis, not without something almost like patience. "They have a ledger. Julian's name is on it. Your name, as his former partner, was added 3 months ago when it became clear he could not pay. Tonight, the men at those exits were waiting for you to walk through them." I sat down. Not because he'd asked me to, because my legs made the decision independently. "The dress," I said. And even saying it, I felt the shape of something I hadn't let myself finish thinking in the car. "In the morning," Kyong said. "We'll know more." He closed the laptop. "Tonight, you stay here." It wasn't a comfort. It wasn't designed to be. But there was something in the simplicity of it, not "you're safe," not "don't worry." Just the plain mechanical fact of "you stay here" that was somehow easier to receive than reassurance would have been. Reassurance could be false. This felt like logistics. I stayed. I didn't sleep. I sat by the window in the gray room and watched the men on the grounds move in their quiet rotations. And somewhere around 3 in the morning, I stopped pretending to myself that I was going to figure a way out of this through sheer will, and I just sat with what had happened. Julian, at the gala, his hand on my arm. The wine. The men at the exits. "You are the collateral." The words arranged themselves in my chest like furniture being moved into a room that was running out of space. By 7, I was in the corridor. By 7:15, I had found the kitchen by smell alone. And by 7:30, I was drinking coffee I'd made myself, the small, defiant act of it feeling more stabilizing than it had any right to when Kyong appeared in the doorway. He looked, for the first time, like he'd slept less than I had. Not disheveled, nothing as human as that, but the precise edges of him were infinitesimally less sharp. He saw the coffee. He said nothing about the fact that I'd helped myself. He opened a cabinet, took a cup, poured from the same pot. "Your team," I said. "You mentioned they'd know more about the dress in the morning." He set his cup down. "Come." The room they used for analysis was behind the operations center, clean, white, lined with equipment I didn't have the vocabulary for. The woman from the night before was already there. She'd had the blue dress since before I'd woken up, and she walked us through it with the detachment of someone reporting weather data. The fabric had been tested. The wine, she explained, contained a compound tasteless, invisible under normal light, but chemically reactive to the syndicate's scanner technology. The dark red stain wasn't incidental. It was the signal. The wine itself didn't need to be ingested. Skin contact was enough to transfer trace elements. Even after I'd changed, the compound would still have been detectable on my skin for hours. She pulled up an image on her screen, a molecular diagram that meant nothing to me, but clearly meant something to Kyong, whose expression contracted slightly, once, before resettling. "He planned it," I said. "Not a question." Julian Reeve acquired the compound approximately 2 weeks ago. She said it without looking up from her tablet. "He entered your name into the syndicate's registry 4 days later. 2 weeks. He'd been planning this for 2 weeks. He'd come to the gala, not in desperation, but in design, with a glass of laced wine and a dress he'd intended to ruin and a woman he'd decided to trade. The humiliation hadn't been secondary. The humiliation had been the mechanism. I stood very still with that information moving through me. I had spent 6 months being afraid of what Julian might do. I had underestimated, completely and catastrophically, what Julian had already done. "Miss Parker." Kyong's voice. Not gentle, just present. I turned. He was watching me with that same unreadable stillness, but something had shifted in it, almost imperceptibly. Not softness, more like acknowledgement, as if he understood that what I'd just been handed was a particular kind of weight, and he was giving me a moment to find where to put it. "I found somewhere." "I put it there. Show me everything," I said. We sat in the operations room for 2 hours. He showed me the ledger, not the original, which existed somewhere in a language of violence and back-channel accounting I would never have access to, but his team's translation of it. Julian's name, the figure beside it, and lower on the page, connected by a line that someone had hand-drawn in the original document. My name, Parker, N. Relationship collateral. Confirmed viable. Viable. Like livestock, like inventory. Kyong walked me through the structure of the syndicate with the brisk, clinical efficiency of a man briefing a new associate. They operated across 6 districts in the city. They dealt in debt acquisition, purchasing the debts of high-risk borrowers from other criminal organizations, and then collecting, by whatever means necessary. Julian had originally borrowed from a smaller outfit 18 months ago, and that debt had been sold twice before landing in the syndicate's ledger at a figure that had tripled through interest and penalties. He had nothing left to give them, except me. He told them we were still together, I said. He told them you were financially entangled, that you had shared accounts, shared property. Kyong's voice was even. It wasn't entirely fabricated. Your names were both on a lease for 14 months. The apartment we'd shared before I'd finally gotten out. 14 months of my life reduced to a line item in a criminal ledger. I pressed my hands flat on the table. You said you'd recently acquired the territory they operate in. He looked at me. Yes, so you were already hunting them when you came to the gala last night. A pause. Small, but there. The gala was an operational opportunity. The syndicate's leadership was expected to attend. They move in those circles, legitimate faces over criminal infrastructure. I was there to observe, and then you saw me. I saw Julian Reeve, whom I recognized as a syndicate debtor. He held my gaze steadily, and then I saw what he did. It wasn't an admission of anything personal, but I understood it well enough. I hadn't been a coincidence, but I also hadn't been the point. I'd become the point somewhere between Julian's hand on my arm and that cascade of dark red wine, and Bae Kyong had made a decision in the space of that moment. I wondered what it had looked like from behind those eyes, that calculation, that conclusion. I wondered what had tipped it. I didn't ask. You said last night there would be a choice, I said instead. New identity and disappear, or stay under your protection while you dismantle the syndicate. That offer stands. I looked at the ledger on the screen. My name in black text on a white background, connected by a hand-drawn line to a man who had once told me he loved me. Viable. If I take the new identity, I said, What happens to my family? My mother lives 40 minutes from the city. My sister. The syndicate would likely reorient toward adjacent collateral. Yes, he said it without flinching, because the truth didn't improve by being softened. And I was beginning to understand that Bae Kyong knew this in the same way he knew everything else as a simple property of the world. And if I stay? You remain under active protection until the syndicate's leadership is neutralized. My operation was already in progress before last night. Your presence changes certain variables, but the objective doesn't shift. How long? Weeks. Possibly less. He looked at me. Possibly more. I thought about the gray room upstairs, the borrowed sweater, the window with its view of men who moved in quiet rotations through the dark. I thought about my apartment, my real one, the one I'd moved into after I left, with the deadbolt I'd installed myself and the kitchen I'd painted yellow because I could now, because there was no one to tell me I couldn't. I thought about the way my sister laughed, my mother's voice on Sunday morning calls. I thought about my name on that ledger, connected by a hand-drawn line. I'll stay, I said. Kyong looked at me for a moment that lasted slightly longer than the ones before it. Then he nodded once and turned back to the screen. The first 3 days were a negotiation I hadn't agreed to enter. It started simply enough. Kyong's people treated me like a package. A valuable one, not mishandled, not mistreated, but a package nonetheless. Someone brought meals to the gray room. Someone laid out a schedule of when common areas were accessible and when they weren't, during what appeared to be shift rotations for the security teams. Someone left a list of what I was and wasn't permitted to do with the compound's internet connection. A list. On the 4th morning, I walked into the operations room without knocking, which, I had gathered, was considered the equivalent of drawing a weapon in this environment, and put the list on the table in front of Kyong. No, I said. He looked up from his laptop with the expression of a man who had genuinely not anticipated this sentence. No, to what? Specifically, to this. I tapped the list. I'm not a guest. I'm not a prisoner. I'm a person who made a choice to be here, which means I need to function like a person, not like a problem you've warehoused. He studied me. The restrictions exist for operational security reasons. I understand that. Explain them to me then. Talk to me like someone who is capable of understanding security logic, and I'll work within the constraints that actually make sense. I held his gaze. But I won't sit in a room following a list handed to me by someone who didn't even introduce themselves. The silence stretched. Outside, someone walked past the door. The compound went about its business. Sit down, Kyong said. I'd rather. Miss Parker. Something in his voice shifted, not loudly, not aggressively, but with a precision that landed differently than his usual flat delivery. Please, sit down. I sat. He closed the laptop. He folded his hands on the table with the deliberateness of someone choosing to give a conversation their complete attention, which I was already learning was not something he did casually. The internet restriction is non-negotiable, he said. The syndicate has technical assets. Anything connected to external networks is a potential vector. This is not a question of your intelligence or my trust, it is a structural fact. He paused. The schedule exists because my team operates in rotations that are calibrated to specific visibility windows. When those windows are open, civilian movement through certain areas creates noise in the pattern. The schedule protects them. Not you. I absorbed this. Okay. The meal's delivered to your room. He stopped. Something crossed his face, brief, almost imperceptible. That was an assumption on someone's part. It will be corrected. Who made the assumption? I did, he said, with a directness that surprised me. I thought it would be. He paused on the word in a way that suggested he'd found several options and approved of none of them. Simpler. Simpler for who? He didn't answer that. He looked at me with that evaluating stillness, and I looked back, and somewhere in that exchange something recalibrated between us. Not warmth, not comfort. Something more structural than either of those things, like a wall being measured and found to be at a slightly different angle than expected. You can access the kitchen freely, he said. "The East Library, the outdoor courtyard between 7 and 9 in the morning, before the active perimeter rotation begins." He named 3 other spaces with brief explanations for each. "In exchange, I need you to remain in your room after 10 p.m. and to notify Minji," he said a name I recognized as belonging to the woman with the tablet, before accessing any new area for the first time. Notify, not ask permission. He almost did something with his mouth that wasn't quite a smile. "Notify. That works," I said. I picked up my list, folded it once, and left it on the table between us. Neither of us touched it again. The days settled into a shape. Not a comfortable one. Comfort felt like the wrong ambition for a compound full of armed men and operational screens, and the constant low frequency of something dangerous being managed somewhere just out of view, but a workable one. I had the kitchen in the mornings. I had the courtyard, where I discovered that physical cold was actually useful, the kind of sensation that made everything else feel slightly more manageable by comparison. I had the East Library, which contained an improbable collection of economics texts and Korean poetry volumes, and 3 dog-eared copies of what appeared to be the same thriller novel in different languages. I slept better than I had in months, which I found disturbing until I understood why. There was nothing left to anticipate. The worst-case scenario had already arrived and rearranged itself into something I could navigate. And the vigilance I'd been running on for 6 months, that constant low-grade alarm, had finally found something solid enough to hand itself off to. It wasn't peace. It was the end of waiting for impact. Those are different things, but the body doesn't always distinguish. Kyong and I moved around each other with a wariness that wasn't hostility. He worked constantly days that had no visible beginning or end. Phone calls in Korean that stopped when I entered a room, not because he was hiding something, but because I gradually understood. That was simply how he operated. Compartmentalized. Contained. He existed in segments that didn't bleed into each other, and I was in one segment while the war with the syndicate lived in another. On the 5th evening, I found him in the kitchen at close to midnight, standing at the counter with a glass of water and a stillness that looked, for the first time since I'd met him, like exhaustion rather than control. He didn't hear me come in, or he heard me and didn't react, which with him amounted to the same thing. I went to the cabinet and got a glass, filled it at the tap, stood at the counter a distance away from him that felt like a reasonable sentence. "You should be in your room," he said, without looking at me. "It's not 10 yet." He glanced at the clock on the wall. It was 9:52. 8 minutes, I said. He said nothing. He looked back at whatever middle distance he'd been occupying before I arrived. "Can I ask you something?" "You'll ask regardless of my answer." "Fair." "Why are you doing this?" "The syndicate was already your target. You could have sent me to a safe house somewhere, let your operation run its course, had no further interaction with me at all." He was quiet long enough that I thought he might not answer. Then, "Because the syndicate would have found you regardless of where you were placed. The mark on that dress was already distributed to their networks by the time we left the gala." He turned his glass slowly in his hand. "You were safer inside the operation than adjacent to it." "That's the operational answer." He looked at me then. Directly. "That is the answer." I held his gaze. He held mine. In the kitchen's low light, with the compound quiet around us and 8 minutes remaining in the day, Bae Kyong looked like a man who had made 1,000 decisions without blinking, and was, perhaps, privately, aware of the weight of all of them. I didn't push it. I finished my water, rinsed the glass, and set it on the rack. "Good night," I said. "Good night, Miss Parker." I was at the door when he said, without any particular inflection, "Nora." I stopped. "It is a more efficient form of address," he said, still not looking at me, "given the circumstances." I stood there for a moment with my hand on the doorframe, this strange, guarded man behind me in a midnight kitchen, the syndicate somewhere beyond the compound walls running their rotations and their ledgers, my name still written in their books. "Good night, Kyong," I said. And I went upstairs, and for the first time since the gala, I slept before midnight. The message came on a Tuesday, 11 days after the gala. Minji brought it to me in the East Library, where I'd been reading the same page of an economics textbook for 40 minutes without absorbing a word. She set a tablet on the table beside me without comment and stood back, and I looked at the screen and felt the floor of the room shift slightly beneath me. It had come through an encrypted channel the syndicate used for debtor communications. One of Kyong's teams had been monitoring 17 such channels since before I'd arrived. The message was short. Julian had never needed many words to cause damage. You have 48 hours to present yourself at the address below. If you don't, I start with your sister, then your mother. The syndicate is patient. You know I'm not. Below the text, a location in the city's east quarter, and below that, a photograph. My sister outside her building, taken within the last week. She was carrying groceries. She didn't know she was being watched. She was laughing at something on her phone. I set the tablet down very carefully on the table. Minji was still standing there. Mr. Bae is waiting, she said. Kyong was in the operations room with 2 men I'd seen but never been introduced to analysts, I'd gathered. Though the line between analyst and enforcer in this compound was drawn in pencil. He looked up when I entered. He'd already read the message. I could tell by the particular quality of his stillness, which was slightly different from his resting stillness, more deliberate, like a held breath. My sister, I said. She is being moved to a secured location as of 30 minutes ago. She believes it's a precautionary measure related to a financial fraud investigation her employer was contacted. Her cooperation was arranged. He paused. She's comfortable. She doesn't know about you. My mother? Also secured. A family friend's home 2 hours north of the city. Her doctor has been informed she needs quiet rest following a minor procedure. He watched my face. They are both safe, Nora. That happened before you saw the message. I stood with that for a moment. The relief was enormous and structural, like a beam sliding into place. Then I looked at the tablet in Minji's hand and thought about Julian taking that photograph. Standing somewhere on my sister's street, watching her laugh at her phone, knowing what he was setting in motion. He's panicking, I said. Yes, which makes him more dangerous. Also, yes. Kyong moved to the main screen and pulled up a map, the city, sectioned into grids, with markers I'd learned to read over the past 11 days. The address he provided is a warehouse in the East Quarter, currently under partial syndicate control. If you walked in there alone, you would not walk out. I'm not walking in there alone. No. He looked at me. But Julian doesn't know that. I understood then what we were about to discuss. I pulled out a chair and sat down. The plan took 6 hours to build, and another 2 to refine. The logic was clean. Julian believed Nora Parker was still a frightened woman who would trade herself to protect her family. The syndicate believed she was an isolated civilian with no meaningful understanding of what they were. Both of those beliefs were assets, not liabilities, if used correctly. Kyong's team identified a safe house they had already flagged as potentially compromised. A building in the North District that the syndicate's surveillance assets had been watching for 2 weeks. Watching but not acting on, because they weren't sure enough of its significance to commit resources. That uncertainty was the wedge. The plan was to make them certain. A controlled leak through 3 channels the syndicate monitored would confirm. Nora Parker was being held at the North District safe house. Julian, feeding information to his creditors in exchange for an extension on his debt, would pass it along. The syndicate would plan an assault. Kyong's people would be ready for it, not at the safe house as a defensive force, but surrounding it, the assault walking directly into a pre-positioned net. Nora's role was presence. She needed to be visible at the safe house, a figure at a window, a confirmed sighting for the surveillance. Julian's people were running to make the bait credible. She would be pulled out before the assault began. The timing was everything. I want to understand the extraction window, I said, during the 2nd hour of planning. Kyong walked me through it. His teams read on the syndicate's assault patterns drawn from 3 previous operations they'd documented suggested a pre-dawn breach. The syndicate preferred darkness, and the specific institutional paralysis of 3 in the morning. We would confirm my presence at the safe house the evening before, through the window, long enough to be seen. Extraction would happen by midnight, 3 hours before the projected breach window. "And Julian?" I asked. "Julian will be with the assault team. He's bought his extension. By delivering this intelligence, they'll want him present to confirm the target, and they'll want to keep him contained." Kyong's voice didn't change on Julian's name. It never did. Julian was a variable in the operation, neither more nor less. When the net closes, he closes with it. I thought about the photograph of my sister, her groceries, her laugh. "Good," I said. "We ran it on Thursday." I sat at the window of the North District safe house for 40 minutes, while Minji managed the surveillance feeds and confirmed 2 of Julian's people registering my presence on their equipment. I felt watched in a way that was different from the constant low-grade surveillance of the compound this was targeted. Specific, the feeling of being a point on someone else's map. I sat still and let them see me, and I thought about Julian somewhere in the city with a phone in his hand, passing my location to the men who'd written my name in their ledger. I was back at the compound by 10:30. By 11, the leak had completed its arc through 3 channels and come to rest in the syndicate's operational network. By midnight, Kyong's teams were in position. I was supposed to be in the gray room. I was in the gray room. I was sitting on the edge of the bed in the dark with my shoes still on, listening to the compound's quiet, and I thought, this is the part where I wait. This is the part where capable people handle the situation, and I remain safely out of the way, and in the morning it's over. I thought about this with a clarity that should have been steadying. It wasn't, because I knew Julian. I knew him in the way that you know someone who has put their hands on you in the dark, someone whose patterns you've memorized not by choice but by necessity, because reading him correctly was the only tool you had. And something about the shape of this plan, the timing, the breach point, the specific building kept pressing against a piece of knowledge I'd been carrying for 2 years without realizing it had operational value. Julian was a coward who understood one thing about strategy. He never came through the front. Every confrontation he'd ever initiated, he'd engineered so that escape was always behind him. He'd corner you with your back to the wall and a door at his shoulder. He'd start fights in rooms he'd already pre-exited in his mind. He'd submitted that warehouse address knowing he'd never actually be there if things went wrong. He'd be adjacent, outside, a distance that felt like participation but functioned as an exit. I pulled up the safe house schematics on the tablet Minji had left me for emergency communication. I looked at the breach points Kyong's team had identified: the main entrance, the east loading door, the roof access. 3 hard points, all covered. And then I looked at the west utility corridor, maintenance access, running from the sub-level to the 2nd floor. Not a breach point, too narrow for a team, barely wide enough for one person moving alone. Julian wouldn't bring a team through it. Julian would use it to get close enough to feel like he was present while keeping an exit at his back. If the assault went wrong, he'd pull Nora out of it personally, not because he cared, but because she was his only remaining currency, and he'd want to be the one holding her when he needed to spend her. I sat with this for 4 minutes. Then I put on a jacket, took the tablet, and went downstairs. I found Minji at the operations console. She looked at me with the expression of someone who had been specifically told to prevent exactly this. "The west utility corridor," I said. "It's not covered." She looked at the screen. Something moved across her face. "Mr. Bae has a team on the perimeter. The perimeter covers the exterior. The corridor runs internal to the building. If someone enters it from the sub-level service entrance on the alley side," I pointed to the schematic on the tablet, "they're inside the building before the perimeter team ever registers movement." She was already on her radio, speaking fast Korean. Static. A response. She spoke again, more urgently. Then she looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her before, which was something adjacent to alarm. "Mr. Bae is engaged on the north side. The breach started 11 minutes early." 11 minutes. The syndicate had come early, less disciplined than Kyong's read on their patterns, or panicked, or both. and the perimeter teams had adjusted, which meant the net had tightened in the direction of the early breach, which meant, "The corridor," I said. "We have one team who can redirect in approximately." She was calculating. I could see it. 7 minutes. I looked at the schematic. I looked at the sub-level service entrance and the alley behind the building and the utility corridor running from there to the second floor. I thought about Julian, about what I knew, about 7 minutes. "Tell them 6, I said, and I was already moving. The drive to the North District took 9 minutes. I didn't count them. I had been in the safe house for 40 minutes earlier that evening. I knew the sublevel. I knew the way the utility corridor smelled concrete dust and old pipework, and the way the emergency lighting cast it in a green-tinted dimness that turned everything into shadow. I moved through it fast, keeping close to the wall, the tablet dark in my jacket pocket. I heard him before I saw him. Julian had never been light on his feet. It was one of the things I'd memorized without meaning to the particular rhythm of his footsteps. Slightly heavier on the left because of an old ankle injury he never acknowledged. I heard that rhythm coming up the corridor ahead of me, and I stopped, pressing into the alcove beside a junction box, and I made myself breathe. Old reflex. Freeze. Become small. Wait for it to pass. I let the reflex arrive. I felt it move through me like weather, and then I let it keep moving. Because I was not in that apartment anymore, and I had a corridor behind me and 6 minutes on a clock and knowledge he didn't know I had. He came around the corner with a phone in one hand and something in the other that I registered as a weapon before I let myself look at it directly. He was dressed in dark clothes, which should have been incongruous on Julian, but somehow wasn't he had always been better at performing the role of threat than at anything that required genuine courage. His eyes were moving fast, checking the corridor, and for 1 second his gaze moved over the alcove without stopping. He hadn't seen me. I looked at the junction box beside me. Old building. The safe house, the kind of infrastructure that had been repeatedly patched rather than replaced. The junction box panel was unlocked, which I knew because the same maintenance crew that serviced the building also worked for Kyong's estate manager. And small logistical facts like this were the kind of thing you accumulated when you paid attention. I opened the panel. 12 seconds later, the emergency lighting in the corridor went out. Julian's reaction was instant, and exactly what I'd predicted. He swore, loudly, the disciplined quiet of his approach dissolving immediately under the surprise. I heard him turn, heard the scrape of his feet on concrete, heard him trying to orient in the sudden dark, and I was already moving, because I didn't need the light. I knew where he was. I knew the 3 feet of space between us, and I knew his left ankle, and I knew how he fell. He went down hard. The weapon skittered across the concrete floor. I heard it stop against the far wall, and I didn't go for it. I didn't need it. I needed the junction panel, which was behind me now, and I flipped the emergency circuit back. The green light flooded the corridor. Julian was on the floor. He was trying to get up. I put my foot on his wrist, not aggressively, just with enough weight to make the point, and I leaned down and I took his phone. He looked up at me. His face was doing something I'd never seen it do before, which was recalculate from a position of genuine loss. And for a fraction of a second, I recognized that I was watching a man understand, for the first time, that he had miscounted something fundamental. "Nora, don't," I said. He didn't. Behind me, I heard footsteps, multiple, heavy, coordinated, Kyong's team, coming through the corridor from the sub-level entrance. I stepped back from Julian's wrist. I stood up straight. I held his phone in my hand, and I looked at him on the floor of a utility corridor in a building his syndicate had just walked into a net, and I felt something I didn't have a word for that was related to completion. Not satisfaction. Not even relief. Something more final than both of those. The team arrived. Julian was secured before he managed another syllable. I was still in the corridor when Kyong came through. He appeared from the sub-level stairwell, moving fast, and he stopped when he saw me. His jacket was gone. There was a cut on his forearm, shallow, already clotting, that he appeared to be entirely unaware of. His eyes moved from me to Julian zip-tied, sitting against the wall with two men standing over him and then back to me. He stood very still for a moment. "The junction box," I said. "The corridor wasn't covered. I told Minji, but there wasn't time." "I know." His voice was different, not the flat operational delivery. Something underneath it, compressed. She told me. "The breach started early. 11 minutes. I know, Nora." He crossed the corridor in 4 steps and stopped in front of me, close enough that I could see the specifics of what was in his face, which was a controlled version of something that hadn't been there before. He looked at me the way he'd looked at the room on the first night, that rapid inventory, checking for damage, finding none. Something in him settled, visibly, measurably, like a tension released from a cable. "You're not hurt," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a verification. "I'm not hurt." He held my gaze for a moment that was longer than the operational ones, and then he looked at Julian. The expression that replaced it was the one I'd seen at the gala, that flat, calculating certainty, that total absence of heat, which was somehow more absolute than anger, because anger exhausted itself eventually, and this did not. He said something to the men standing over Julian. Korean, quiet. 3 words. They stepped aside. He crouched down so that he was level with Julian, who had the self-preservation instinct, at least, to go completely still. Kyong didn't raise his voice. He didn't gesture. He spoke for approximately 45 seconds in a tone that was almost conversational, and I don't know exactly what he said, but I know what I saw. Julian's face, moving through several stages of understanding, each one worse than the last. When Kyong finished, he stood up. He looked at his team. "Take him," he said, in English. For my benefit, perhaps. Or perhaps because he wanted it said plainly. With the others. Julian was taken. Kyong turned back to me. He looked at his own forearm as if noticing the cut for the first time, which I suspected was actually true. "The north side?" I asked. "Contained." He said it with a finality that covered everything the word needed to cover. The syndicate's leadership came with the assault team. They believed the bait strongly enough to want to be present for the retrieval. He looked at me. "It's over." Those 2 words landed differently than I'd expected them to. Not with relief, exactly. With a kind of spaciousness, like a door opening onto a larger room. Everything that had been pressing against me for 11 days, for 6 months, for the years before that, found the door and moved through it, and I stood in the corridor's green emergency light and let it go. Kyong was still watching me. "You went against the plan," he said. I improved the plan. Something shifted in his face. That almost expression, the one that wasn't quite a smile but lived in the same neighborhood. "Yes," he said. "You did." Weeks passed. The syndicate's dismantling was not a single event but a process, the kind of thorough, meticulous work that Kyong approached the way he approached everything, with a precision that left no useful piece standing. Ledgers were acquired, assets were seized, and the network of debt and threat that had transformed my name into a line item was unwound with a patience I found, from a distance, genuinely formidable. I wasn't present for most of it. By the 3rd week, the price on my head had been formally dissolved. Minji explained this to me with the same clinical brevity she used for everything, and by the 4th week, Kyong told me that my sister and mother could return to their routines. I was there when my sister called. I sat in the East Library with my phone pressed to my ear and listened to her voice and said yes, I was fine. No, it was complicated. Yes, I would explain when I could. And she laughed at something I said that wasn't even funny, and I held on to that sound like it was a fixed point. I stayed at the compound longer than was strictly necessary. I knew this. Kyong knew it too, in the way he knew most things without remarking on it, without applying pressure in either direction, simply filing it as a known variable and leaving the equation to resolve itself. We ate dinner together twice in that final week. Not planned both times, it was the late kitchen, the hour between operational days when the compound settled into something that wasn't quite quiet but was as close as it got. Both times we talked about things that had nothing to do with syndicates or ledgers or exit strategies. And I discovered that Kyong had opinions about economic theory that were genuinely interesting, and a very dry assessment of the 3 thriller novels in the East Library that made me laugh out loud, which appeared to surprise him. He didn't ask me to stay. He didn't ask me to leave. On a Friday in the 5th week, I packed the small bag I'd accumulated, the borrowed clothes, the book I'd finally finished, a few things Min-ji had arranged without my asking, and I told Kyong I was returning to my apartment. We were in the operations room. He closed the laptop. "The apartment will have been checked," he said. "The locks were replaced last week. You'll receive a number, not mine directly, that connects to a team that will respond within 4 minutes if you use it. Kyong." The response protocols are, "Kyong." I waited until he looked at me. "Thank you." He held my gaze. Outside, the compound went about its business. Somewhere a door closed, and someone spoke, and the world continued its rotations. "There is a function," he said, "at the Grand Plaza, in 3 weeks, the Harrington Foundation's Spring Gala." He said it with the careful neutrality of someone who had decided to say a thing and was now committed to delivering it precisely. "I will be attending." I looked at him. "Operational reasons?" "No." I let the word settle. "Then, I'll need a new dress." Something moved through his expression, that almost expression, the one I'd been cataloging for 5 weeks without a definitive name for it. "Yes," he said, "you will." The Grand Plaza was the same. Crystal chandeliers, string quartet, 500 people in their finest clothes, building the beautiful architecture of a world that ran on money and pretense. I knew, now, what lived underneath it, the ledgers and the debts, and the men at the exits checking their lists, and the knowledge didn't frighten me. It clarified. It gave the room its actual dimensions instead of the ones it wanted to present. I stood at the top of the entrance stairs, and I was aware of myself in a way I hadn't been 3 weeks ago. Not the self-consciousness of a woman who expected humiliation, but the opposite. A woman who knew exactly what she was walking into and had chosen to walk in anyway. The dress was gold this time, not the cautious choice of someone trying to go unnoticed. Floor length, structured at the shoulder, a slit at the hem that moved when I moved. My hair down for once loose, not constructed, because I was done constructing things I didn't need to. No one was going to spill anything on this dress. Not because the world had changed, but because I had, and the world could feel it. Kyong was waiting at the base of the stairs. Dark suit, different from the gala weeks ago, but cut with the same architectural precision that seemed to be a personal requirement. White shirt, collar open, no tie. The gold watch catching the chandelier light when he turned and saw me on the stairs, and something moved through his expression that was no longer the almost expression. It was something that had arrived fully, without qualification, and he didn't attempt to school it away. He reached his hand out when I reached the bottom step. Not protective, not possessive. A gesture between equals, offered and waiting. I took it. We walked into the Grand Plaza together, and the room did what rooms do when Bae Kyong enters them. It registered his presence and adjusted itself accordingly, but this time it registered mine as well, and I felt that registration move through the crowd like a current, and I understood that I was no longer a woman other people were making decisions about. Someone offered champagne on a tray. I took a glass. Kyong took one. We stood at the edge of the room for a moment, side by side, surveying it. "Last time," I said, "you were watching from the bar." "I was watching you," he said, with his characteristic precision. "From the bar." I turned to look at him. He was looking at the room, but there was something in the angle of it, that same quality I'd recognized in the kitchen at midnight, in the corridor after the breach, in a dozen small moments across 5 weeks, that told me the room was not actually what he was attending to. "The syndicate representative in the far corner," he said, without changing his tone, "is looking at you." I looked. A man in his 60s, silver hair, a smile that was used to purchasing the room's approval. He caught my eye and nodded, the practiced pleasantry of someone who was filing me into a category. He doesn't know yet, Kyong said, that the category he's placing you in no longer exists. I raised my glass slightly in the man's direction. A small, precise acknowledgement. The man smiled back. He'll learn, I said. Kyong looked at me then, fully, the way I'd first looked at those economics textbooks, not for information, but because the thing itself was worth attending to. Yes, he said, he will. The quartet shifted into something new, and the room moved with it. And Nora Parker, who had stood in this same ballroom 3 weeks ago with dark red wine soaking through a blue dress and a hand locked around her arm, and the old freeze settling into her bones, stood in gold at the edge of it, unheld and unafraid, and decided that the night was still early. Can Bae Kyong protect what's growing between them when the syndicate's last ghost comes collecting? And what did Julian sell to buy himself one final night of freedom? Subscribe and turn on notifications, because you do not want to miss what comes next. This story is only getting darker. Drop a comment, do you think what's growing between Nora and Kyong can survive what's coming for them? Like this video if you're obsessed with this Mafia romance that keeps raising the stakes every single chapter. The next chapter drops soon, and trust me, you are not ready for the truth about who Nora Parker really is to the syndicate. See you in the next one. If Nora makes it out of what's coming.